Our guest today is a Cook County Commissioner. He brings a fresh perspective to the Board of Commissioners and is an outspoken voice for changing business as usual, unquote, in Cook County. Our guest today was sworn in to office in 1998. His efforts to shed light on the actions of Cook County government led to the election of even more reform-minded commissioners. Our guest today worked his way through Loyola University School of Law and the University of Chicago, where he earned his master's degree in public policy. He is an adjunct professor of political science at Loyola University and Roosevelt University, lecturing on politics, the environment, and local government. He and his wife Barbara and daughters Allison and Megan live in Lakeview. Ladies and gentlemen, Cook County Commissioner Mike Quigley. Mike.
I'm Mike Quigley, and I am and always will be Bernie Hansen's Chief of Staff. I also have to mention ahead of time that whatever else I say about TIFs, the TIF in Elmwood Park is great. I feel an increased pressure I feel an increased pressure today speaking before you. It's not just that such an august body, it's the situation that we're in. Local government in Illinois is in chaos. As our economy rests on the cusp of a recession, our governments are racing each other in order to tax everything imaginable. These governments are showing more creativity in creating new taxes than they are in attempting to reinvent themselves to provide services in the most effective, efficient means and manner possible. And meanwhile, the public reads of the scandal du jour in today's paper. And no one uses the word budget anymore without the word doomsday in front of it. I swear, John, and folks at Loyola, the budget books are going to have to start being changed. Just have the word doomsday stamped in front of them from now on. So bear with me as I attempt to make some sense of all this. And while today's discussion is about tax increment financing, in reality, it is about open and transparent government and the desire to reinvent, restructure efficient government to provide appropriate services for all. So bear with me. I know there was some concerns about how I started this thing, and there was some give and take at the beginning. And Phil Crone, I don't see him here, but he gave me some interesting advice. He said, compare TIFs to a car that doesn't have a speedometer. If you really look at TIFs, it's probably a car without a speedometer, without an odometer, without brakes, without seat belts, without safety restraints or a headrest. But before I begin, let me go back to the original. My staff that's here is just outstanding. Jason Lechty, my Chief of Policy. My Chief of Staff, Kimberly Walls. And my former Chief of Staff, Jennifer Kohler. I don't think they're here, but I also want to recognize two people who are really the reason we're here today, or you'd be here, you'd be talking to someone else. Ben Jarofsky from The Reader and Jacqueline Levy. Those two folks kept the idea of TIFs alive for a long time. You know, when I took this job, I became known for promoting the concept of reinventing government. If we could start over, how would we be restructured for maximum efficiency? I've since come to believe that the concept must include maximum levels of transparency and accountability as well. So we must consider this discussion as part of a bigger picture. That is, tax increment financing in relationship to larger issues. For example, the extraordinary bleak financial situation facing the city, county, and state. The financial situation that is mass transit. The extraordinary consolidation of power within the mayor's office at the expense of the democratic process. Now, You know, when I say those things, Alderman Tunney reminds me, that's why you're not on so many Christmas card lists. It is not my intent to upset anyone, but someone has to call for change now. If not now, when? If the situation for local government could be worse, I don't imagine a better time to talk about those things. And as for TIFs, let's put it in perspective, folks. We're talking about a $500 million fund, basically and essentially controlled by one person. That is $500 million that is off budget. That is $500 million that is not on a tax bill. Folks, that's more money than we spend on streets and sanitation. But it's not on a tax bill. And there is no real study of their effectiveness mandated or actually accomplished within our cities that allow these TIF programs to go forward. This is $500 million that in a very real sense has allowed the city to paper over its problems, to rescue itself from embarrassing situations. It's $500 million that in a very real sense is a hidden tax hike with a serious impact on other governments. Now, I've spoken to groups, this is the largest, but from 3 people to as large as this, from Lawndale to Lakeview, Evanston to Sauganash, Lincoln Park to Oak Park, and oh yes, that trip to Springfield to speak to leadership in the governor's office. I left there with really 2 thoughts in mind. How fast can this car go? And part of that, I'm so glad I'm a county commissioner and not a senator or a representative. But the second real thought was, it's hard to imagine. I met with Speaker Madigan. He was one of the sponsors of TIF legislation in the early 80s. And it's hard to imagine that if they knew then what they see now, how they would have gone forward. Because the original intent of TIF legislation was to develop truly blighted areas. It's hard to believe the original sponsors of TIF statutes foresaw the existing situation, that 30% of the city of Chicago's land area would be under a TIF district, that nearly 12% of every property tax dollar collected in Chicago would go to a TIF fund, that TIF collects and spends more than my government does in property taxes every single year. At least as of today, there are 156 TIFs in Chicago and 378 TIFs in Cook County. And as I said, TIFs collect $500 million in 2006 in Chicago and $800 million in the county of Cook in the year 2006. From its humble beginnings, as you see that little chart that was passed out, it's a meteoric rise for revenues that are raised and spent by TIFs. Folks, we're talking the verge of Carl Sagan numbers now. Millions and millions. Or perhaps Dirksen would be better to describe it, right? $500 million here, $500 million there. Pretty soon it adds up to real money. But again, all off budget, all off tax bill, without information on evaluation or effect. Let's remember, mosquito abatement districts are on tax bills. Sanitary districts with 50 customers are on tax bills. Special service areas within the city of Chicago are on tax bills and are far more transparent and accountable. But in the brief time we have today, let's discuss how the money is spent, how the process works, issues of transparency, issues of effectiveness, and its impact on other government. These are just, I suppose, the highlights of how TIFs have been used in recent years. Millennium Park. Announcing the park project in 1998, this was said to be a park built at no cost to taxpayers. Ultimately, there were $95 million in TIF funds used to cover cost overruns. Not just the building of the park, folks, understand, cost overruns. In the year 2000, the city announced the use of $35 million in TIF funds to cover rising cost. In 2001, the administration announced another $30 to $50 million in TIF funds will be used for the park. In 2004, as the park opens, TIF funds used to cover the Millennium Park Cost overruns now total $95 million. TIF funds were also used to cover debt payments when the parking garage revenues failed to meet projections in 2001 and 2002. And Millennium Park isn't even within the Central Loop TIF district. In 1999, the city sought and won change in the state law to allow cities to use TIF money for properties just outside their boundaries. And it's not that the park isn't a valuable asset. It's just that the project was marred by no bid contracts, conflicts of interest, violations of state purchasing laws, failure to get building permits, design flaws, and management turmoil. What else? The Chicago Board of Trade Merck merger. The city is considering $40 million subsidy for a merger that cuts jobs. The Block 37 Superstation, ongoing. $42 million in TIF funds sunk into what can only be described as a wildly over-budget project. It's currently $100 million over budget, and more TIF funds are being considered to make up the shortfall. It is fair to ask at this time of crisis, how many stations could have been renovated with this kind of money? How many slow zones could have been repaired? Union Station, among other things, in a $58.8 million grant, 200 condos. The Old Main Post Office, a $51 million TIF grant, which includes, among other things, 300 condos. I guess I conclude best with the quote from Cranes coming out of the July 23, 2007 edition. In subsidizing this deal, Mr. Daley confirms that tax increment financing, as practiced in Chicago, is nothing more than a bag of economic goodies for the mayor to hand out to favored companies. How does the process work? In the most polite way to describe it, it is a rigged game. Not for personal gain, mind you, but is a rigged game in terms of how these things are approved and how the money is spent. And why do I say that? As of this point, the City Council has shown no desire to slow the extraordinary pace of TIF development in the city. The CDC, whose purpose is to oversee the TIF process, the Community Development Commission, there are 15 members. And with all due respect, the mayor appoints every single one of them. So, have they been a rubber stamp? If you looked at their votes between 2005 and 2007, there were 812 votes cast. 808 of them were yeses. This is reinventing the concept of a rubber stamp. The Joint Review Board, which among others and the City Council votes to approve TIFs. This is not independent government as compared to the balance of the state. Unlike in other cities, one person controls 4 of the 6 seats on the Joint Review Board: the city, the park district, the public schools, and the city colleges, and arguably a 5th, the public member, is his former chief of policy. Only Cook County is formally independent of the mayor. And I like those people. I have a lot of respect for the people who are in charge of those offices, but I haven't heard them ever publicly disagree with the mayor. In other cities, there's a dynamic tension that exists across the state between governments. Independently elected school boards and park districts provide checks and balances and are frequently, and this is important, able to extract concessions from municipalities. School districts across the state, dramatically impacted by TIFs, fought back. And because they were elected independently, they were able to extract concessions to help those school children. And finally, in this regard, who decides how the money is spent? Frankly, from what I've said and what we've described, in effect, one person. This indeed, unfortunately, is not a democratic process. As important as any of these issues are the lack of transparency and information. The city only recently put financial information and profiles for each TIF on its website. The complete compliance reports are still unavailable online. Previously, only district maps and CDC agendas and minutes were available. Even the compliance reports are largely inscrutable. full of required financial disclosures and list of expenditures over 5,000, but no specifics, and no citywide totals. And as I have said, the JRB and the CDC are an embodiment of the rubber stamp. I often hear, are you the only one saying this? Well, last week was an important week. Cook County Clerk David Orr released a report which shot up how much money was being used on, or was being collected and spent by TIFs, but the Civic Federation released an important study in which they professed their support for TIFs, but were extremely concerned, as they said, bear with me, the Civic Federation supports the use of tax increment financing as a municipal economic development tool. However, we believe that there is insufficient transparency in the availability and quality of TIF information provided to the public. We strongly support enhanced state and local reporting requirements to improve the provision of TIF information available to citizens and lawmakers. And finally, the public is not well served by obscuring the total amount of any government's property tax resources or any other revenue source. But it's often said they're so important, they do so much good. It overcomes all the problems you've talked about. It is assumed for a second, though, that the big but-for test wins out, that the but-for test trumps all other aspects of TIFs, that but-for TIFs, the Loop would be a ghost town, and that there'd be no economic development in the city of Chicago. I think the academic analysis of these TIF programs begs to differ. In a 1997 by DIE of TIF in northeastern Illinois, it found that in 26 of 79 municipalities, the equalized assessed value within the TIF district grew more slowly than outside the TIF district. 2000 study by DIE and Professor Merriman, cities with TIF grow more slowly after adopting the program than those that did not. 2002 NCBG study, of the $1.66 billion in expected growth likely, only 362 million of that growth was attributable to TIFs. And the 2006 study by Byrne, TIF leads to growth in areas with high vacancy and older buildings, but question why some TIFs are located in areas with natural advantages that would be expected to grow anyway, like the Loop. Well, a lot of what I've learned in being here this time is sort of the education of the independent. And I'm not necessarily sure what that word means all the time, but I get the general essence of it. And for me, it wasn't ever enough to just critique and say, here's what's wrong. So I think lesson one for those who wish to do this is you hire a great staff, you surround yourself with people smarter than you are, and then you document and analyze things. And my staff took a very long time in writing this report, available online, A Tale of Two Cities, Reinventing Tax Increment Financing. To me, it was important to not just to differ, but to explain and offer alternatives. So my own study concluded that TIFs simply don't work 40% of the time in Chicago. It is also important to note that between 1999 and 2004, the Loop grew at a 7.9% clip without a TIF. The new area that has just recently been TIFed grew at 7.9% on its own. So what happens to that increment? TIF takes credit for it. TIF keeps that money. It's ours. In a very real sense, this is the city putting its arms around the economic engine of Chicago and saying, for 23 years, any growth in taxes because of property value increases, new construction, or inflation is ours. So it's also been, I guess it's fair to ask, to summarize that point is, are you capturing growth or are you creating it? It's also, well, we do a lot of good things with that money. I think you can do a lot of good things with $500 million no matter what you do. We could have a good time. I mean, you know the situation that Mass Transit's in, that the county of Cook is in, and the state of Illinois? It's a lot of money. If you give us $500 million, hey, we run the largest integrated court system in the United States, largest single-site jail, 3 pretty important hospitals, and 16 healthcare clinics, and a forest preserve district that acts as the filters for air and water pollution. Those are important too. And in the end, there's only so much you can do with all those revenues. And when they're being shifted, or in a sense skimmed off the top, as I think TIFs do, you lose the ability for those other governments, including our schools, to operate efficiently and effectively. Much else has been brought about the term of porting. Porting is when they shift funds from one TIF district to another. When you read the literature, Chicago claims that it doesn't port, but between 2001 and 2005, it shifted $35 million from one district to another. And I think that undermines a key tenet of TIF, that funds for a district should be generated by growth within its borders. So what do we have here? In a sense, you have a hidden tax hike with serious financial impact on other governments. Some local governments see their base eroded over time by inflation. So you got 23 years. How much was this land in this area worth 23 years ago versus now? For those other governments, it's still frozen out for 23 years with the possibility of 12 more. There's nobody in this room, with few exceptions, I imagine, that'll be around in 35 years if the new loop TIF is extended to its possible duration. So there's no policy consideration on what to do, how to plan. It is dibs, this is mine, for 35 years. If TIF captures growth that would have occurred anyway, it unfairly deprives local governments of that base. Throughout Illinois, that includes and impacts most specifically schools. And since TIF raises tax rates, it leads to political pressure on local governments to keep their taxes down because they have a smaller base as time goes on to tax. So if they do have to raise taxes, its impact is greater on those that are impacted as well. Recommendations. From my study and the Civic Federation study, the following recommendations are completely consistent. A full financial information about TIF should be included in every municipality's annual operating budget. Great things happen during budgets. It may be ugly to watch, but there's a lot of analysis. Almost every dollar is tracked, and community groups and business groups and editorial boards come and they fight about all this. And it's ugly to watch, but if they're all in agreement, my advice is check your wallets. The democratic process, that healthy tension, works. And if you don't have that, and all you have is people you appointed deciding how that money is spent, you lose out a great deal. TIF redevelopment plans should include specific goals and budgets and should be subject to periodic review. TIF information, including maps, plans, budgets, and redevelopment contracts, should be made available online. Civic Federation also recommends that the state of Illinois should require info about TIF districts and projects to be available online using the same format currently required of local governments for their financial information on the state comptroller's website. My additional recommendations, including putting proposals for TIF districts, should include the study of the potential impact on all other local governments, including schools. TIF information should be included in some form on our tax bills. This is something I've sat down with David Orr about several times. It's complicated, it's not going to be easy, but it must be done. The Illinois General Assembly should reform its TIF legislation to protect local governments from the effects of inflation. And the CDC should probably be abolished, and there should be some attempt at starting over, especially with local neighborhood input added. In addition, TIFs must be made to show that they work. They don't have to do this through 23 years. They have locked in revenue for up to 35 years, and no one ever says, prove to me that those tax dollars were worth it. They should at least have to do this every couple years. Show me this TIF grew this area faster than the rate of inflation, faster than the areas that are adjacent to it, and that they were worth the expenditures of taxpayer dollars. So where do we go from here? You know, these overall problems of scandals and waste and bloat and lack of transparency, they weren't created overnight. And this problem wasn't created by one group of individuals or any one person. Some problems were created by scandals, others by mismanagement, some were created by us. But ultimately, all of it was created by a serious lack of transparency and accountability at all levels of government, as well as the lack of political will to reinvent and streamline. And until policymakers let go of their turf, power, and jobs, you will continue to see the meaningless fights in Springfield and Cook County and Chicago that accomplish nothing. And you will continue to see taxing bodies fight to get first in line to raise revenues from everything they can possibly tax. With the crisis we face at all levels of government in Illinois, we must ask ourselves, if we were to start over today, whether it be any one of these levels, what would our government look like? It would be hard to believe that we would resurrect the same system. Who would bring back townships? Just kidding. It would be hard to believe that we would resurrect the same system, the same archaic bureaucracies, the same redundant levels of government, the same artificial boundaries between levels of government that inhibit maximum efficiency. Instead, we would ask ourselves, what should we do? How should we do it? And who should do it? And we would have a system of transparency and accountability. In short, we would challenge the status quo and stand up for our citizens. Jefferson wrote that in a democracy, people generally get the kind of government they deserve. But without transparency and accountability, a true democracy does not exist. Without transparency and accountability, people are not allowed the kind of government they deserve. This is what we must seek to change. I thank you for your time and your attendance. Any questions? No, I don't like Diet Coke.
Oh, God. Okay, we heard that over there.
I like water. I don't like Diet Pepsi
Dasani
either.
water. Isn't Dasani made by Coke? Anyway, okay.
Chicago water.
This might end up being a totally stupid question because the first time I really paid attention to TIFs was at your speech today. Okay. If I'm
If I
somebody,
had a dime for every time I heard that.
if I'm somebody who lives in Chicago, TIFs are a lot better for me than someone who lives in some other area of Cook County, because then all the money that's captured by the TIF goes to me in the city, and it means I don't have to waste it to other people in Cook County. So, because I don't care if my money goes to other cities in Cook County. So the only reason that Cook County government wouldn't like it is because the city of Chicago government is getting money that you guys would want for the county.
Okay?
Is that true, or maybe I misunderstood
Well,
what you
let
were
me
saying?
put it this way. I suppose that would be true if you forget that there's about 200 TIFs in Cook County outside Chicago. These, present company accepted, he's really sensitive about this, by the way. The mayors outside Chicago are clever, hardworking, effective public servants, and they see that TIFs are the way to go. I mean, quite frankly, privately, they'll tell you, very few people know I'm doing this, and it's sort of a way to raise revenues without publicly raising taxes. So I guess my short answer to you is it hurts everyone because it shrinks the tax base and your bills are going to go higher. Your tax bills are higher
Mine
because of
actually
TIFs.
just went down this last time. So and I was told, don't tell
It's all
anybody. 'Cause
they
it's
would
not
have been
supposed
less.
to go down.
We
'Cause
would have
then
written
people
you
will
a
look.
check if it. No, I'm just kidding.
So if it's good
they-
for Elmwood Park, if Mayor Silvestri wants to do what's best for his city, what's wrong with that?
Well, I
That's
suppose
good
you-
for him, the same way it should be good for me in Chicago, because I don't care about outside Chicago.
I suppose
don't go there.
you could make that argument for every tax increase. It's going to be good for that city. You can do good things with tax dollars. You can build roads. You can build schools. So you can be a hero with tax dollars. But first of all, even if TIFs were running top efficiency, there's no transparency and accountability. Off budget, off tax bills. Second, if everybody raises TIFs, everybody is shrinking the future tax base for everything but those TIF districts. It especially is going to hurt those little home rule governments that you like so much. So it's going to raise your taxes, and it is just because the city is led the way doesn't mean that those suburban mayors have forgotten this. They're smart people too. So TIFs are going to affect you one way or another financially. They're going to do some good, but anything worth doing is worth doing publicly.
If there's no, are you coming up for a question? Oh, because if there's no other, I had some more back and forth. But I'll give up my spot.
Hi, Mike. I'm Rika Sloan. I am a constituent of yours. I'm proud to be a constituent of yours.
Thank you.
And in a previous life, I served 8 years in the Illinois General Assembly, and I can tell you that this is an issue downstate as well, where they TIF cornfields and say they're blighted. And
Corn can get blight.
oh, sure, not that kind of blight.
Oh, sorry.
And bring them into communities and use them to build shopping centers or whatever they're going to use them for. So this is not exclusively a city problem. I guess my question, however, is more prospective, and that is, do you favor, and if so, why, the possibility of a constitutional convention in Illinois that might give us an opportunity to have another crack at what our
A
government
lot of
looks
things,
like?
right? Yeah, I
Yeah.
favor a constitutional convention to address a lot of issues, not the least of which is our property tax system and how horribly we fund education in the state. But you could take a crack at a lot of the problems that exist in Illinois with a new constitutional convention. I don't want to give up on TIF reform without going to that extreme. And I think the county and I think the city and the state all can take their cracks at dealing with this in terms of letting people know more specifically how TIFs operate and how they impact their bottom line.
Thank you.
Thank you. My constituents can line up behind him.
Afternoon, Mike. Thank you. I have just a question, and maybe you can clarify something you said for me. There are two potential problems you've pointed out with TIFs. One, the lack of transparency, and two, the mechanism by which they measure their effectiveness. Now, I'm a little at odds with you on the effectiveness measure because I think most of us in this room would agree that measuring the effectiveness of a community is a pretty mixed bag when you sit down and try to add up what did what to where. And so there alone, I think that the question of saying how you would come up with a measurement for TIFs is an open question.
I'm ready to talk. You're right. It's not going to be easy, but it's worth talking about.
But my other question is that in terms of how the money is allocated, you mentioned transparency. If all of that information were available and provided to people, and there are other types of taxing entities that do that, how much real participation do you imagine would come of that? Because I think from you saying $500 million was gathered in the room, I didn't know that anyone was aware. I wasn't aware. But certainly I didn't and don't see from other types of these revelations people storming the city council and saying, hey, what are you doing with our money? So my question is it really the allocation that people should be upset about, or is it the fact that this is being collected at all? So that's my question.
Well, I think the bottom line is they're not aware. As most people say, they don't understand TIFs. And look, what's the difficulty? It's hard to get into a soundbite. It's not sexy. It's complicated. Someone told me if TIF money was used in a sex club, it would be on the front page of every paper. Sadly, I think that's how things tend to operate here. But I think democracy has its own inertia, and information drives people's interest. And the reason they're not storming the city council is they like their alderman, as I like my alderman too. And they don't know that this even exists. And they don't know that in one manner or another, it impacts their tax rates. So I think if you put it on their tax bill and you run it through the budget, you know, I declare victory and go home. Because I think that that information will drive public interest in good government groups and editorials and folks to that dynamic tension that fights over resources. And I think that would be enough to make TIFs operate far more efficiently and fairly. Yes?
My name is Mo Headington. I'm from Cook County, Burr Ridge. And first of all, I want to applaud you publicly, as well as Commissioner Silvestri and your Director of Policy, Jonathan Lechty, for your
Close
work
enough.
on the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, the resolution that you brought up and sponsored, which I hope can be a topic for another occasion with this body. But specific to your question, your issue of tax base, I was at the county board meeting where it was passed, and fairly overwhelmingly, to tax pollution. And there would have been enormous monies coming by taxing the old coal plants in Illinois for their pollutants. And yet, some weeks later, President Stroger vetoed that. And my understanding now is that somewhere in some of the energy dealings, it's off limits to tax polluters. The money was supposed to be earmarked that was raised towards public health, which I think would help us all enormously. And now we're looking to tax the public for what we need in public health. And I wonder if you can address this and provide some clarity.
I think the sponsor was here today, Commissioner Marino, if I'm not mistaken, was the sponsor of that particular measure. I think the problem was everything we did last year's budget happened at the last minute, and bad things happen in budgets when you play the brinksmanship game, which happened. And I applaud the president for having the budget introduced so early this year. I think it's not fair to say we're going to tax those power plants without some sense of rewarding good behavior as well. So in the end, my goal is that those that put on best available control technologies and do something should be rewarded. The whole notion of a tax as it relates to pollution should be an inducement to be green in that sense. And that's what I favor. My goal isn't to put people out of business with taxes. I'd rather see taxes as it relates to pollution and pollution credit issues be done as a carrot to encourage those to provide best available control technology, especially with these particular coal-burning power plants whose technology is from the early 50s. As I teach this at Loyola, my students say, well, the 50s, that's not so bad. The technology might have been okay. You know, I hold up my cell phone. I said, think of a phone in 1953 and think of it today. And think of a coal-burning power plant and the damage it can do today, not just to our own citizens, but those who live in northwest Indiana, the acid rain we create in the east, and global warming that we are racing to head off. But thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for having me.
On behalf of the City Club, here's a City Club mug. Thank you. And a one-year membership to the City Club and a history. Meeting adjourned. Thank you very much. Give him a round of applause.